Have you ever faced a storm so fierce it could steal your breath and your life in mere minutes? Picture this: a lone man, a former Green Beret named Ethan Daniels, battling a deadly blizzard in the heart of rural Wyoming to save a stranger, only to uncover a connection that will change his life forever. Just 24 hours later, a military helicopter lands on his remote property, stirring whispers of a hidden past and a destiny he never saw coming. This is a story of courage, fate, and the invisible threads that bind us across time. A tale that will leave you breathless and inspired. Welcome to Daily Narrated Stories, where we bring you gripping narratives of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Ethan Daniels, 43, had served 15 years as a Green Beret before an honorable discharge 6 years ago. Now, he lived in a modest cabin 20 miles from the nearest town, working as a mechanic at a small garage. His life was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of his military years. The scars on his body, especially the jagged one on his left shoulder from a 2011 mission in Kandahar, told stories of a past filled with danger. Each morning, Ethan woke at 4:30 a.m., ran 6 miles through the rugged terrain, and completed 120 push-ups and sit-ups, a routine etched into his bones from his military days. His Chevy Silverado, always stocked with a survival kit, emergency rations, and rescue gear, mirrored his readiness for any crisis. At the garage, Ethan was the go-to guy for fixing anything, earning respect for his work ethic and trust for his integrity. Yet, he kept his past a secret, his piercing green eyes hinting at experiences few could fathom. Ethan's seen things. His boss, Clara, would whisper to new hires, "Best mechanic I've ever had." The garage was the only repair shop within a 60-mile radius, a lifeline during Wyoming's brutal winters. While others grumbled about emergency calls, Ethan always stepped up, his truck equipped with snow chains, extra fuel, and recovery tools that had saved countless stranded drivers. One icy Friday in late December, a monstrous blizzard roared into the region. Forecasters called it the worst storm in 60 years, with winds howling at 50 miles per hour and temperatures plummeting below zero. Ethan had left work early, his truck battling the worsening conditions as visibility dropped to nothing. The radio crackled with warnings. All residents must stay indoors. Travel is life-threatening. Ethan, who had trained in Arctic survival in Norway a decade ago, knew the risks. 30 minutes in these conditions without proper gear meant hypothermia or worse. The highway stretched before Ethan like a ghostly thread, barely visible through the swirling snow. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, using tactical driving skills honed in the military. Each gust of wind threatened to shove his truck off the road, and even with his experience, Ethan felt the storm's ferocity. This wasn't just a commute, it was a battle. His mind flashed to a mission in the Caucasus Mountains, where his team had faced a similar whiteout. They'd nearly lost 2 men that day, a memory that sharpened his focus now. Back then, he'd been the one giving orders, his voice steady despite the chaos, ensuring his team made it out alive. Now, alone in his truck, he felt the weight of that same responsibility, to survive, to make it home. The storm's howl was a haunting echo of those mountains, the snow a relentless enemy that cared nothing for his training or his will to live. Ethan's jaw clenched as he recalled the faces of his fallen comrades, their laughter replaced by the screams of that mission. He'd promised himself he'd never let fear dictate his actions again, but the storm was testing that resolve, its icy fingers prying at the cracks in his armor. Ethan's cabin was still 10 miles away when the wind surged, reducing visibility to zero. He slowed to a crawl, his truck's headlights barely cutting through the blizzard. He knew this road intimately, every bend, every dip, but this storm was unlike anything he'd seen. The forecasters weren't exaggerating when they dubbed it the blizzard of the century. The cold seeped into the cab despite the heater's best efforts, and Ethan's breath fogged in the air, a stark reminder of the danger outside. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, his hands steady but his mind racing. What if the storm worsened? What if he didn't make it home? He thought of his cabin, its warm fireplace, the creak of the wooden floor, the solitude he'd fought so hard to find after years of war. That solitude had been his sanctuary, but now it felt like a distant dream, one the storm might steal forever. The radio crackled again, a distorted voice cutting through the static. Wind speeds reaching 60 miles per hour. Power outages reported, stay off the roads. Ethan turned it off, the warning only amplifying the dread pooling in his gut. He didn't need a reminder of the stakes. He could feel them in the way the truck shuddered with each gust, the way the snow seemed to swallow the world whole. At about 5 miles from home, a dim flicker caught his eye through the snow, a car's hazard lights, blinking weakly from a ditch. Ethan's instincts screamed, danger. The temperature had dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill made it feel like minus 35. Stopping was reckless, but someone could be trapped, facing death by hypothermia. Ethan's heart pounded as he wrestled with doubt, a flicker of fear he hadn't felt since his military days. What if I can't save them? What if I don't make it back? The memory of a failed mission in 2009 surfaced unbidden. A young soldier he couldn't save, his screams swallowed by the desert wind. Ethan had carried that guilt for years, a weight heavier than any rucksack. The soldier's name was Ramirez, a kid barely 20, with a laugh that could light up a room. Ethan had promised to get him home, but a sniper's bullet had stolen that chance. He'd held Ramirez as he bled out, the boy's last words a whispered plea. Don't let me die here, Cap. Ethan had failed him, and the shame had driven him to Wyoming, to a life where he could hide from such failures. Now, staring at the stranded car, that shame roared back to life. He couldn't let another life slip away, not if he had a chance to act. But the storm was a beast, and he knew its hunger. His training kicked in, overriding the fear. He couldn't leave someone to die. He pulled over, positioning his truck safely and activating his hazard lights. From the truck bed, he grabbed a waterproof parka, insulated gloves, a balaclava, and snow boots. He also took a tow cable, a high-powered flashlight, and a first aid kit. Tying a rope to his belt and securing the other end to his truck, a trick from Arctic training to avoid getting lost, he stepped into the storm. The wind hit him like a wall, snow stinging his face like shards of glass. Each step was a fight, his boots sinking into the deep snow as he counted his steps. 18 to the road's edge, 14 more to the stranded car. The cold was a living thing, clawing at him, seeping through the seams of his gear. His breath came in sharp, painful gasps, the air so cold it burned his lungs. He could hear his old drill sergeant's voice in his head. Move with purpose, Daniels. Hesitation kills. Ethan moved, but every step felt like a gamble, the storm whispering promises of failure. The wind seemed to mock him, its howl a chorus of voices from his past. Comrades lost, missions failed, promises broken. He shook his head, forcing the ghosts away, but they lingered, their whispers blending with the storm's fury. The cold bit through his gear faster than he'd expected, even with his training. Ethan estimated the wind chill had dropped to minus 40 degrees, lethal conditions. His fingers ached despite the gloves, and his face felt raw, the wind slicing at his exposed skin. He thought of his Arctic training in Norway, where he'd spent 72 hours in sub-zero temperatures, learning to survive with nothing but a knife and a tarp. Back then, he'd been surrounded by his team, their laughter and curses a lifeline in the dark. Now, he was alone, the storm his only companion. He remembered a moment from that training, when he'd nearly given up, his body trembling from the cold, his mind screaming to quit. His teammate, Jackson, had grabbed him by the collar, shouting over the wind, "You're a Green Beret, Daniels. You don't get to quit." That memory fueled him now, pushing him forward, but the storm was relentless, its icy grip tightening with every step. He could feel his body slowing, the cold seeping into his bones, and for the first time, he wondered if he'd pushed too far. As he reached the car, a small SUV half overturned in the ditch, his heart sank. The right side was buried in snow, and the driver's window was frosted over. He wiped it clear with a gloved hand, the ice scraping against his palm, and peered inside. A man, around 65, sat slumped in the driver's seat, shivering violently, his breath shallow. His eyes were glassy, a telltale sign of early hypothermia. The man's face was pale, his lips tinged blue, and his hands clutched the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to life. Ethan's stomach twisted. He'd seen that look before, on soldiers too far gone to save. But this man was still alive, still fighting, and Ethan wouldn't let him go without a fight. He banged on the window, the sound muffled by the howling wind. The man turned slowly, his gaze unfocused, his lips moving as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. The door was jammed, snow and the car's angle working against him. Ethan braced himself against the frame, his boots slipping slightly on the icy ground, and yanked with all his strength, the icy wind rushing in as the door finally gave way. The man flinched at the sudden cold, his body trembling harder, a low moan escaping his lips. "I'm here to help," Ethan shouted over the storm, his voice hoarse. "Can you move?" The man nodded weakly, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead, likely from the crash. Ethan's medical training kicked in, possible concussion, definite hypothermia, but no signs of spinal injury. They needed to move fast. The man's skin was pale, almost translucent, and his shivering was slowing, a dangerous sign. Ethan's mind raced through the stages of hypothermia. If the man's core temperature dropped below 95 degrees, his cognitive function would collapse, and death wouldn't be far behind. As Ethan tried to pull the man out, he realized the man's legs were pinned under the crumpled dashboard. The temperature was dropping by the second, and time was slipping away. Ethan's fingers, even in insulated gloves, were starting to numb, the cold creeping up his arms like a predator. He faced a brutal choice: free the man now, risking further injury, or wait for help that might never come in this storm. "If I wait, we both die," he thought, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He remembered a training exercise in Alaska, where he'd had to make a similar call, cut a teammate's gear to free him from a crevasse, knowing it might mean frostbite. They'd both survived, but the teammate had lost 2 toes. Ethan had never forgotten the man's screams, the way he'd begged not to be left behind. Now, staring at the stranger in the car, Ethan felt that same dread. What if he made the wrong call? What if he caused more harm than good? The storm seemed to sense his hesitation, the wind howling louder, the snow swirling faster, as if urging him to fail. He thought of Ramirez again, the boy he couldn't save, and the promise he'd made to himself. Never again. He couldn't let this man become another ghost to haunt him. "I'm going to have to force you out," Ethan warned, his voice steady despite the chaos. "It'll hurt, but it's our only shot. Trust me, I've been trained for this." Using a multi-tool from his kit, Ethan positioned it under the dashboard, calculating the leverage point with precision honed from years of extraction missions. The cold metal burned through his gloves, and the wind threatened to knock him off balance. He had one chance before the cold sapped his strength. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the cold, and he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus. The storm seemed to sense his vulnerability, the wind howling louder, as if daring him to fail. Ethan's shoulder ached, the old wound a constant reminder of his limits, but he pushed the pain aside. He had to do this. For the man. For himself. For Ramirez. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, picturing his cabin, the warmth of the fire, the smell of pine. He'd get them both there. He had to. "This is going to hurt," Ethan said, locking eyes with the man. "When I lift, pull yourself out, fast." "Got it." The man nodded, a spark of clarity in his eyes, perhaps sensing Ethan's confidence. Bracing himself, Ethan pushed with everything he had, his muscles screaming as the dashboard lifted just enough. The metal groaned, a sound like a wounded animal, and Ethan's arms trembled under the strain. Sweat beaded on his forehead, freezing almost instantly in the frigid air. "Now," he yelled, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. The man groaned in pain but managed to drag his legs free, his face contorted in agony, a cry escaping his lips that cut through Ethan like a knife. Ethan dropped the tool, the metal clattering against the car's frame, and caught the man as he slumped forward, nearly collapsing into the snow. The man's weight was heavier than Ethan expected, his body limp with exhaustion, and Ethan's knees buckled for a moment before he steadied himself. Without hesitation, Ethan hoisted the man onto his shoulders in a fireman's carry, a technique he'd mastered in training. The man's weight pressed against him, and each step through the knee-deep snow felt like wading through quicksand. The sky was pitch black now, the storm relentless. Ethan's old shoulder wound throbbed, a sharp reminder of his limits, but he pushed through, following the rope back to his truck. The wind screamed in his ears, a banshee's wail, and the snow stung his eyes, blurring his vision. He stumbled once, his knee hitting the ground, and for a moment, he thought he might not get up. The man's weight was crushing, and the cold was sapping his strength faster than he'd expected. His legs burned, his lungs ached, and his vision swam, the whiteout disorienting him despite the rope. He thought of his team in Kandahar, the way they'd carried him to safety after the ambush, refusing to leave him behind. He owed them this. He owed himself this. Just a bit further, he muttered, as much to himself as to the man, his voice raw with determination. The rope was his lifeline, but it felt like a thread, the storm pulling at him, trying to tear him away. He stumbled again, his foot catching on a hidden rock, and he nearly went down, the man's weight dragging him forward. Ethan caught himself at the last second, his free hand sinking into the snow, the cold biting into his skin. He growled, a primal sound of defiance, and pushed himself up, refusing to let the storm win. Finally, they reached the truck, the rope his lifeline in the whiteout. Ethan's legs burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop until he'd opened the passenger door and gently placed the man inside. He cranked the heat to maximum, the warm air a stark contrast to the icy hell outside, and wrapped the man in a thermal blanket from his emergency kit. The truck's interior light illuminated the man's face, and Ethan froze. Those deep-set hazel eyes, the faint scar on his jaw. There was something hauntingly familiar. A memory stirred, a fragment from a chaotic night in Kandahar, a surgeon's steady hands, a voice promising he'd make it. But the memory was fleeting, buried under years of trauma, and Ethan couldn't place it. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog, but the man's face tugged at something deep within him, a thread of recognition he couldn't quite grasp. "I'm Ethan Daniels," he said, his voice tight with emotion, his hands still trembling from the cold. "We'll get you to a hospital soon, but first, we need to warm you up." The man's gaze sharpened as the heat revived him, his shivering slowing. He studied Ethan, then glanced at the scar on Ethan's hand, a remnant of a shrapnel wound from years ago. "Daniels," the man rasped, his voice trembling with recognition, a hint of something deeper, something like awe. "Captain Ethan Daniels. Green Beret, Team 5. Ethan's heart stopped, the words hitting him like a punch. How did this man know his rank and unit? His mind raced, searching for answers, but the storm outside seemed to press in, the wind a mocking chorus to his confusion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his instincts on high alert, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he always carried, though he stopped himself. The man managed a weak smile, his lips still pale, but his eyes alive with memory. "Dr. Samuel Harper. I was the surgeon at the forward operating base in Kandahar, April 2011. Memories flooded back. Kandahar, 2011, an ambush. Ethan had been bleeding out, his shoulder torn open by shrapnel, the pain so intense he'd thought he was already dead. A field surgeon had operated on him under fire, his hands steady as bullets whizzed overhead, his voice a lifeline in the dark. "Stay with me, Captain. You're not done yet." That surgeon had saved his life, had given him a future when he'd been sure he had none. "Dr. Harper," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking, tears stinging his eyes, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. "You saved me." Harper nodded, his own eyes glistening, a tear slipping down his weathered cheek. "And now you've saved me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was on my way to see my son in Cheyenne when the storm hit. I never thought I'd be the one needing rescue." Ethan felt a warmth unrelated to the truck's heater, a warmth that spread through his chest, thawing the icy grip of his past. After 14 years, he'd repaid the man who'd given him a second chance. "I never got to thank you," Ethan said, his throat tight, his hands clenching the blanket as if to anchor himself. "They moved you to another base before I woke up. I thought I'd never see you again." The memory of waking in that field hospital, his shoulder bandaged, his team gone, hit him hard. He'd asked for the surgeon, desperate to thank the man who'd saved him, but no one knew where he'd been sent. Ethan had carried that gratitude like a debt, one he'd never thought he'd repay, until now. Harper adjusted the blanket, his color slowly returning, though his hands still shook. "That's how it is in war," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years. "We touch lives, then move on, never knowing the full story. I've thought about you often, Captain. Wondered if you'd made it, if you'd found peace." Ethan swallowed hard. the words hitting him harder than the storm ever could. Peace. He'd been searching for it ever since, in the quiet of his cabin, in the rhythm of his daily runs. But sitting here, with the man who'd saved him, he realized peace wasn't just a place. It was a moment, a connection, a debt repaid. He thought of the nightmares that still woke him, the faces of the men he'd lost, the guilt that had driven him to solitude. Harper's words were a balm, a reminder that he'd survived for a reason, that his life still had purpose. Ethan checked Harper's pulse, stronger now, but the leg injury worried him. Possible fibula fracture, Harper assessed, his medical training evident even in his weakened state. The right leg's just bruised. Ethan nodded, impressed by Harper's clarity, though he could see the pain etched in the man's face. "I've got splints in my kit," Ethan said, his voice steady now, the soldier in him taking over. "We'll stabilize that leg soon." He glanced out the window, the storm still raging, a white wall of fury that showed no signs of stopping. The hospital was too far, the roads too treacherous. His cabin was their best bet, a place to wait out the storm, to keep Harper alive until help could come. But a nagging doubt lingered. What if the storm didn't let up? What if help never came? Ethan pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand, but the fear lingered, a shadow at the edge of his mind. As they sat in the truck, the blizzard raging outside, Ethan couldn't shake the surreal coincidence. Of all the people to crash within his reach, it was the man who'd saved him years ago. "Fate's a strange thing, isn't it?" Harper said, echoing Ethan's thoughts, his voice soft but resonant. Ethan nodded, his mind drifting to the countless missions, the lives he'd touched, the lives he'd lost. He thought of the soldier he couldn't save in 2009, the guilt that had driven him to solitude. Maybe this was his chance to balance the scales, to prove he could still make a difference. Harper's presence felt like a sign, a whisper from the universe that he wasn't done yet. He thought of the dreams he'd had over the years, dreams of Kandahar, of the surgeon's voice pulling him back from the brink. He'd always woken with a sense of longing, a need to find that man, to thank him. Now, here he was, a living testament to the strange workings of fate. Ethan decided to take Harper to his cabin instead of risking the hospital in this storm. It was only a few miles away, and he had enough supplies to treat Harper's injuries. The drive was slow, the road a minefield of snowdrifts and ice, but Ethan's focus was razor-sharp. He kept one eye on Harper, watching for signs of shock, and the other on the road, navigating by memory more than sight. Harper was quiet, his breathing steady but shallow, and Ethan could feel the man's exhaustion, his pain. "Hang in there, Doc," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble over the hum of the heater. "We're almost there." The truck hit a hidden patch of ice, skidding slightly, and Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. He corrected the slide with a steady hand, but the near miss left him shaken, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. The storm wasn't done with them yet. It was a predator, waiting for a moment of weakness, and Ethan knew he couldn't afford to give it one. On the drive, they shared pieces of their lives, the words a lifeline in the dark. Ethan spoke of his quiet years after the military, the way he'd thrown himself into routine to keep the memories at bay. "I needed the silence," he admitted, his voice raw. "After all the noise, the gunfire, the screams, I needed something steady." He thought of the nights he'd spent staring at the stars from his cabin porch, trying to outrun the echoes of war. Harper listened, his eyes soft with understanding. "I get that," he said. "I retired 7 years ago. Now I work as a consultant for government agencies. It's less chaotic, but I still feel the pull of the field." He paused, then added, "I was recruited by a special unit in the Department of Defense. We develop emergency, slightly smiling face medical protocols for elite teams." Ethan glanced at him, a flicker of curiosity cutting through his focus on the road. Harper's words hinted at something bigger, something that might explain why he'd been on this road in the first place. But the storm demanded his attention, and he filed the thought away for later. At the cabin, Ethan helped Harper inside, the warmth of the small space a stark contrast to the storm outside. He started a fire, the crackle of the logs a comforting sound, and tended to Harper's wounds. The forehead gash was minor, but the leg needed a splint. Ethan worked with the precision of a soldier, his hands steady as he wrapped the splint, but his mind was elsewhere. The coincidence of finding Harper, the storm, the timing, it all felt too perfect, too orchestrated. He thought of the missions he'd led, the way every detail had to align for success. This felt like one of those missions, but he couldn't see the full picture yet. As he handed Harper a mug of hot coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls, he couldn't hold back the question any longer. So, why's a retired doctor driving alone in the storm of the century? Harper's expression turned serious, his hazel eyes locking onto Ethan's. I wasn't just visiting my son, Ethan, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I was coming to find you. Ethan froze, the mug nearly slipping from his hand, the coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Me? What? His heart raced, a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Harper set his coffee down, his movements deliberate despite the pain in his leg. Have you heard of Project Sentinel? Ethan shook his head, his mind racing. It's a new Department of Defense initiative, Harper continued, his tone measured but urgent. We're assembling veterans with rare skills to train civilian rescue teams for extreme natural disasters. He explained that with climate change, disasters were becoming more frequent and severe. The government needed specialists like Ethan, who'd led 4 Arctic missions and held the highest cold weather survival certification. You're the perfect fit, Harper said, his voice firm. And after what you did today, I'm more convinced than ever. Ethan sat back, processing the revelation, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Why now? I've been out for years. Harper smiled knowingly, a glint in his eye that made Ethan's stomach twist. The DoD never loses track of assets like you, Captain, Harper said. We need someone who understands civilian life but can operate in the worst conditions. Ethan's mind raced. So this storm, your crash, it's all a coincidence. Harper winced as he shifted his leg, the pain evident in his grimace. The crash was real, he assured, his voice steady. I planned to reach you tomorrow, but the storm had other ideas. Sometimes, fate moves faster than we do. That night, as the blizzard howled, Harper shared more about Project Sentinel. The program aimed to create elite rescue teams for disasters like wildfires, floods, and earthquakes, teams that could operate where others couldn't. Ethan felt a spark of purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the military. The idea of using his skills to save lives, without the specter of war, stirred something deep within him. He thought of the lives he'd lost, the ones he couldn't save, and the ones he still could. You'd start as a trainer, Harper said, his voice warm with conviction. But we see you as a field leader. Your combination of Arctic expertise, combat medical training, and extraction experience is rare. Ethan listened, his mind racing with possibilities, but also with doubts. Could he step back into a world of high stakes, of life and death decisions? He'd left that behind for a reason, but the pull of purpose was strong, a call he couldn't ignore. By morning, the storm had eased slightly, the wind no longer a scream, but a low moan. Ethan made breakfast, the smell of eggs and coffee filling the cabin, while Harper made a call, his cell signal suspiciously strong despite the remote location. Yes, sir, I'm with him, Harper said, his tone formal. He's even better than we thought. Pulled me from a wreck in conditions that would have killed most. A pause, then a nod. Yes, sir, we'll be ready. Ethan handed Harper a plate of eggs, the steam rising in the cool air. Ready for what? Harper grinned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. That was General Carter. They're sending transport as soon as the weather clears. Transport? Ethan raised an eyebrow, his tone skeptical. I haven't even agreed to join. Harper chuckled, the sound warm despite the tension. General Carter wants to make his pitch in person. Hard to say no to a 4-star. By noon, the skies had cleared enough to reveal the damage. 3 feet of snow blanketed the area, isolating them completely. Ethan was clearing a path, the shovel scraping against the icy ground, when he heard it, the unmistakable thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotors. A Black Hawk descended, landing in the clearing near his cabin. That was fast, Ethan muttered, setting down his shovel, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and unease. General Nathan Carter stepped out, his 4-star insignia gleaming, followed by 2 aides. Captain Daniels, he said, extending a hand, his voice commanding but warm. Thank you for saving Dr. Harper. He's invaluable to our program. Ethan shook his hand, slipping back into military protocol despite the years away. Just doing what needed to be done, sir, he replied, his voice steady but his mind racing. The general's eyes narrowed, a flicker of respect in his gaze. "Not many could have done what you did last night," he said firmly. "That's why we need you." Inside, General Carter laid out Project Sentinel's full scope. Climate models predicted a surge in natural disasters over the next decade. The program would establish 6 regional centers, each with teams trained for specific disasters. "This isn't a re-enlistment," Carter clarified, his tone matter of fact. "It's a civilian contractor role with clearance requirements. You'd start at our Wyoming facility, training teams for cold weather rescues." Ethan asked detailed questions about protocols and equipment, his Green Beret meticulousness shining through. He thought of the gear he'd used last night, the way his gloves had failed to keep out the cold, the flashlight that had flickered in the wind. If he was going to train others, he'd need better tools, tools that wouldn't fail when lives were on the line. After an hour, Carter stood, his presence filling the small cabin. "We need to get Harper to a hospital. I'd like your answer before we leave." Ethan glanced around his cabin, the sanctuary he'd built to heal from his past. The walls were lined with books, the fireplace still crackling, the air heavy with the scent of pine and coffee. It had served its purpose, giving him the peace he'd needed to rebuild himself. But maybe it was time for more, time to step back into the world, to use his skills for something greater. "I'm in, sir," he said, his voice firm, a decision made. "But I have a condition. I want to say in the cold weather gear. Standard issue won't cut it in storms like this." Carter smiled, a rare warmth in his stern features. "That's why we want you, Daniels." As Ethan packed a bag, Harper approached, limping on his splinted leg. "Life's a circle, isn't it?" he said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of their shared history. 14 years ago, I saved you. Yesterday, you saved me. Now, we'll train others to save countless more. 20 minutes later, Ethan boarded the Black Hawk, the Wyoming landscape shrinking below as he headed toward a new chapter. 6 months later, Ethan stood before Project Sentinel's first graduating class, 28 men and women trained in advanced cold weather rescue techniques. "The environments you'll face will try to kill you," he told them, his voice steady with the authority of experience. "But you're ready to save lives where others can't." In the audience, Harper, now the program's medical director, sat beside General Carter. "Best decision we made? Bringing him on board," Carter whispered. Harper nodded, a quiet pride in his eyes. "The best rescuers are those who've been rescued. They know what's at stake." This story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. A single moment of bravery can ripple across years, touching lives in ways we can't imagine. Ethan's journey shows us that our past, with all its pain and triumphs, shapes who we become and who we can save. Have you ever had a moment where a small act of kindness came full circle? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how you've seen fate at work in your own life. At Daily Narrated Stories, we're committed to bringing you tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the power of human connection. Don't miss our next story, where a former Marine risks everything to save a village from a tsunami, with a twist you'll never see coming. Subscribe now. Time's running out to join our community of story lovers. Your support helps us keep sharing these life-changing narratives. Hit that button, and let's honor courage together.